I was not going to introduce the speaker today because Brad was not going to be our speaker. Chris was going to be introducing our speaker. No. But our speaker had an emergency and couldn't make it today, so I was hunting around for a new speaker, and I put out a frantic call to the faculty, and Brad responded. He's giving a presentation next week, as a matter of fact. So he says, hey, I can try it out on you guys and see what works and what doesn't work. So for those of you who don't know Brad, he's a new faculty here in the Geological Oceanography, working in the Paleo Lab. Came from Tulane. So I think some of you may have seen his presentation when he gave his interview. A lot of you may not have, but from what he tells me, this is completely different anyway, so it doesn't matter. So take it away, Brett.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, this is, when I gave my interview talk, I had maybe 1 or 2 slides on this kind of stuff and said, and we do this too, and went on to the next subject. So I'm going to go into a little more depth on this. And what I'm going to be talking about is carbon cycling in river sediments in POC, and a method that we've kind of thrown at this problem, and we think we've made a lot of headway in it. So to start off, I mean, this work I've been doing for a few years now, and I've had a lot of colleagues who've helped me, mainly the top column of people, just the people who've worked on certain rivers in the past, and have sent me samples, and I've been able to get them interested enough in our approach for them to share their precious samples with me. And I've also worked with some other colleagues on just general carbon cycling, and they've also shared their samples. And of course, in bold here are the students that have worked on some of the slides that I will show you. And I put them in bold because the other people just gave me samples, but the actual people who did the work were the students. And I've had a master's student in 2011 who did a big part of this work. It's sort of a pilot study, and we've carried on with that with 3 other students contributing to the slides you'll see here. So we're going to be talking about dating here, radiocarbon dating, though not dating, but I figured I would look into what makes a good date. It's a good night to bring everybody up to speed on this, and you know, I found some interesting websites to look at too. I mean, allwomenstalk.com. I don't know what that means, but it's you type this into Google right now, and there's lots of hits, right? And every list seems just about the same. And unfortunately for me, every list starts with comb your hair, which I'm in trouble as it is. So. And you get into some of the typical things. Listen to your date. Don't just keep talking. And when you do talk, don't talk about those subjects. And don't show up an hour late or an hour early. Evidently, that's bad too. Something that wasn't really around when I was dating was the electronic devices, and I guess we have some modicum of putting those away. But probably one of the things that doesn't make it on many of these lists, but it goes unsaid, is that you shouldn't bring other dates with you. And that's the nature of what we're doing when we're radiocarbon dating. Is we're taking advantages of some of the recent develops in basically the improvements in precision and the sample size needed to get a radiocarbon date, and we're turning a single date into multiple dates. So different from going on a regular date, I would actually argue that this is a good thing to bring other dates with you. So what we're talking about, geologic sense, for those of you that don't enjoy working on mud and like to work on living things, we're talking about absolute dating. And in geology, there are 2 things that you can do to get an idea of time. Relative dating, which is just looking at which things are older than other things in terms of strata. And absolute dating, which actually puts things onto some sort of a calendar scale and relates it to our time scale. And this term is used in geology and archaeology. It's important to realize, though, right from the beginning here, what I'm talking about is that sometimes when you hear the term absolute dating, you think that a date might be absolutely right. And it's not. It's a constraint on the calendar age of a geologic or archaeologic material. It gives you for instance, some absolute dating can be referred to as a maximum age constraint, where the sample is definitely younger than a certain age or definitely older than a certain age. But the best absolute dates give you both a maximum and a minimum, and the age is somewhere in between there. And that's important to remember as I go on here. Now, if you look at something like this beautiful sediment core here that I've never touched, I just pulled a picture off of Google of a beautiful sediment core. And you can see this is nicely varved, and this is your textbook sediment. Every one of those layers was deposited on top of the other, as long as I don't have the picture upside down. But it's in chronological order, and each one of these then, if you think of absolute dating, should be an absolute date, and you should be able to go up and date all of these layers. And it's important because we can learn about ecology and climate and seawater chemistry and what I'll talk about the carbon cycle in geologic past during time periods where we were not making active observations. So, and I'd like to point out that in this case generally, not only in the method that I'm going to tell you about, but in all methods, it's very much okay to bring other dates and date it in many different ways to try to get an idea. This is no trivial text to put a time frame onto a pile of mud that looks like this. So one of the key issues, though, there's so many ways you can date sediments and other geologic strata that you have to really be what you're actually dating. And I'm going to be talking about C14. So in any sediment like this, you have some sorts of carbon that are contributed to the sediment. It might be useful to think of sediments as basically all of Earth's system's garbage dump. Everything goes downhill and ends up piling up. You don't get sediments that look like this unless you're piling sediments on top of sediments and it's getting drained in from higher points. And you basically get an amalgamation of every different source and process on Earth piled in here. Anything that has to do with carbon then is in any one of these layers. And that becomes important when you try to use the tool of C14 dating on such a core. Here's just a simple cartoon of the carbon cycle. Most of you know about this. We have sort of the atmosphere joining the terrestrial carbon cycle and the marine carbon cycle. Some very big pools, some smaller pools of carbon. We have this little thing coming down here through ocean sediments and reactive sediments here. And I put this up here just to emphasize that what I'm going to be talking about are rivers. And rivers also join the terrestrial to the marine carbon cycles, but some of the sediment that comes out from rivers also gets involved into the marine sediments. And this little flux here, even though it's small compared to other reservoirs and other fluxes, is very important because it's sort of the link between the rock carbon cycle and the biological carbon cycle. So we can use those terms sort of simply. This cycle is moving fast, and carbon is cycling during time spans of organismal life. And once you get it into this part, you get into another part of the carbon cycle that's happening at an altogether different time scale. And what's important about this is that when we have even slight changes in this flux, we can cause some pretty big changes in, for instance, atmospheric composition. So this small flux, don't judge it by its size. It's very important. And fundamentally, when we talk about this delivery system of terrestrial carbon and sediment to the marine system, and this is a satellite view of the Mississippi River, having two outlets, the Atchafalaya River and the Mississippi here. Really what we're looking at in this type of a picture, when we see these sediment plumes around the outlets, is sediment that will ultimately end up here, but it's at time zero, right? So what I want to get at is what is the spectrum of radiocarbon ages in this time zero sediment? And what does that tell us about our carbon cycle? So a few words on methods here. Don't necessarily need to know how it's done if you're not interested, but just one thing to know is that, like most things that have been around for a while, radiocarbon dating has really improved in the last 3 decades with the advent of AMS, accelerated mass spectrometry. So if you take any organic carbon or calcium carbonate, anything with carbon really, you can convert that into CO2 and some other chemicals quantitatively. And what we used to do is we used to use a beta counter You used to need several grams of material. To get a really useful date, you would have to count for weeks at a time to get enough statistics behind your date to make it useful for most questions. Nowadays, you need around 1 milligram of carbon, in some cases even less. And for an even better age, you only need about 1 hour of measurement on the accelerator mass spectrometer. So that's sort of what we're trying to take advantage of here. So how are we ruining a good date? Well, we're ruining a good date, as some would define a good date. We're taking advantage of better dating, basically, using a process that we call the ramped pyrolysis system. And if you're around me and you're around my students, you'll hear us talk about the dirt burner. So to simplify it, what we do is we take a bunch of dirt, to use a four-letter word for geologists, because we don't like to call it that, and we burn it. And what we do is we burn it in very controlled way. This is a cross-section of our system, and then we have a furnace on top that we gradually ramp up the temperature. And that's where our sample is held with a helium atmosphere that's flowing through it. And we gradually ramp the temperature up at 5 degrees a minute. And as the temperature increases, the organic components in the sediment start to become unstable at different temperatures, and they break apart. When they break apart, process called pyrolysis, they're entrained in this helium flow, and they flow into our second furnace where they're rapidly oxidized. And then we do a lot of vacuum line chemistry and separation and quantification of the CO2, but we also take different temperature intervals and we trap that CO2 and we can radiocarbon date it. So this is the process that we call ramp pyrolysis C14 analysis. Really, this is only illustrating the ramp pyrolysis part, and once we get the CO2, we can do a lot of things to it, stable carbon isotopes and ramp and C14 as well. So that means that we can take one sediment sample and we can take several different temperature intervals of radiocarbon dates, and we can turn that into a few dates. Okay, and this is one of the first publications that we had back in 2008, sort of a proof of concept where we split one sample into 9 different radiocarbon dates. I'm going to show you a lot of these curves. You see temperature on the x-axis, and that thick black line is sort of the reaction curve. So we produce a little bit of CO2 at first, and the CO2 gets to a maximum point. We call this the Tmax, or the temperature of maximum CO2 generation. Then the reaction kind of dies off. It usually dies off a little more quickly than it starts. And all through this reaction, we were taking temperature intervals, which are denoted by these bars. The height of the bar corresponds to this axis, which is radiocarbon years. And in this specific example, we took one core depth from Antarctica, and we showed that there can be a over 10,000 year difference in the ages in that one core depth. It breaks a little bit from our textbook understanding of a sediment core where each layer has one age. And now we're showing you that this one layer that we dated can have up to and probably more than 10,000 years of age range within the carbon that was constituting that sediment. So that was obviously a way to ruin a date. A lot of people have made, especially the reason we were doing this in Antarctic sediments was because there's not a lot of foraminifera, there's not a lot of calcium carbonate that's preserved in those sediments. So a lot of times people, in order to come up with a chronology, have had to date just an organic carbon signature. And the way they would do that is you take the core top sediment, which is your time zero sediment, and measure the radiocarbon age of that. And you'd get an age that was greater than 0, let's say 2,000 years. And part of that is the reservoir effect because the DIC already has some age. And the other part was assumed to be this contamination with older material that was coming off of the Antarctic continent. And that's been in progress for years. And then we came along and showed that that might not be a smart thing to do to get a good, accurate chronology of the core, because you're basically averaging all of these different components of the radiocarbon. But what I'm going to talk about from now on is not so much the use of this technique for chronology, but more for carbon cycling questions, namely focusing on riverine POC, or particulate organic carbon. So we try to get two isotopic signatures, the radiocarbon content, which gives us an age, but it's also related to source, especially if you already know the age of the sediment. And in the case that you're taking sediment that is in the water column that hasn't settled out, we call that time zero sediment. So you know its age, and that means that the radiocarbon signature is more related to source. And then you can get some additional information about the source from the stable isotope ratio. So this is another example from some riverine particulate organic carbon, and you can see here that first of all, we get a bimodal distribution, and both of those modes have very different ages. And when we start to get radiocarbon ages that are up around 30,000 years, we're talking about a sample that had very, very, very little C14 in it. So one problem with using C14 is that there's a lot of carbon that just is not going to register as C14 age because with all the improvements, we can still only measure back to about 60,000 years, and the Earth's history is a lot longer than that, right? according to some scientists. But in any case, again, we're talking about rivers here, so we're transitioning from the terrestrial to the marine ecosystem. And in the terrestrial ecosystem, these rivers can be picking up carbon from recent biomass, which should have a very young radiocarbon signature. And it could also be cutting into fossil rocks and getting into the fossil carbon and mixing that together. So we expected to see a very wide age spectrum here. This is one of the first river samples that we did, and it was very interesting to see that. Now, a few years after our initial investigations using this method, this conceptual model came out, and this is published by Neil Blair and Bob Aller in Reviews of Marine Science. And what it shows is that the type of carbon that gets transported by river systems is and then ultimately may be preserved or reworked in marine sediments is highly dependent on the margin type. So in geology, we refer to passive margins and active margins. Active margins are generally your collision areas where you have mountain building forming and in some cases subduction. But in any case, an active margin has a very fast and steep conduit from the highest points through river systems into the ocean, and they usually have a narrower shelf, whereas passive margins have a wider shelf and a longer transit through river systems. Now these little bar graphs are important because it shows you basically 4 different types of carbon and what you would expect to find in these sediments. So you start off with the core of your mountain range, and a drop of water that falls up here is going to go in one of 2 directions, if it falls right at the divide. And the carbon that's sourced up here, if you're really way up high in the mountains, is really only going to be what's called kerogen carbon, really old rock carbon. So there's going to be no carbon-14 in that. It may have been biologically produced millions of years ago, but it's been incorporated into the rock carbon cycle and eventually uplifted into mountains, and now these river systems are eroding into it. As it goes down each side of the mountain, it's going to rapidly pick up some modern terrestrial sea when it gets into the tree line and it starts to have leaf litter and other and primary productivity. And then it differentiates depending on which side that water is going down the divide. On the active margin, you basically inject this bimodal mixture right into the marine, and you add some marine carbon to it in different proportions, and by the time it gets off shelf, it may not have really reworked the terrestrial carbon and replaced it with marine carbon. Whereas when you go through the long floodplain, and an example of this, something like the Mississippi River going through a long thousands of kilometers of relatively flat land, you get a mix of modern and aged terrestrial carbon, and that's because the floodplains serve as a sink of carbon for thousands of years. And eventually you start to dilute the kerogen carbon, and then you get off into the shelf here and you add more and more marine carbon, and because there's so much deposition and resuspension on the shelf, you end up getting mostly marine carbon that's buried here. So you basically what this means is that you belch a bit of that terrestrial carbon back into the atmosphere. And that becomes important if some of what goes back into the atmosphere was originally kerogen, right? This is pretty important for a carbon cycle. So I pretty much said all of this. This is an emerging conceptual model. It turns out that when this was published, there weren't many ways to test that model, but this ramp pyrolysis method is actually perfectly suited to test it, and this is what we've been doing with a lot of our river samples recently, and that's what we'll focus on. So first, I'm going to talk about the left side of that conceptual diagram here, the small mountainous rivers. So these are referred to in the literature as SMRs. So SMRs are not like the Ganges Brahmaputra. However, we have a river that's just, we sampled it just outside of at the flank of the Himalaya range, at the front range. And this is taking suspended load out of the river, so actually filtering the water and getting the sediment out. And what we see, we sampled this in 2 different monsoons. My colleagues at Woods Hole, Valier, Gali did a lot of work in this whole system, and this was one of the more interesting samples that he sent me. And this is the bimodal distribution that you saw earlier. It picks it's the same thing in different monsoon seasons, a little bit different proportionality here. These plots are showing radiocarbon age. We also can turn this into a delta value, which I've related to radiocarbon years here and delta values here. So negative 1,000 means that it's devoid of radiocarbon. And you can see that basically what we do is we take the sample, we do the ramp pyrolysis, we get the radiocarbon dates. So these are our measured information, and this is our model that we put this to. Basically modeling each reaction curve as a series of Gaussian approximations to some chemical groups. And we can solve for these because we end up with 5 known ages and 4 unknown ages, and we get at the hottest part of our reaction, the later parts, we get very old or very radiocarbon-free components here. So this sort of backed up hypotheses that there were 3 main sources of carbon that are in this type of a river system, and it also shows that this model of having a bimodal distribution of 2 different sources of carbon seems to be supported by these data. Okay. What's perhaps more interesting, this is the Narayani River that I just showed. We have other sites that are also along the flanks of the Himalaya, and these correspond to the curves on this plot, which we haven't gotten radiocarbon dates for all of these. This is preliminary work that we have